Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Love Marriage.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
So, Whit, in light of recent news, are you a prepper yet?
You should ask my wife whether I am capable of preparing for anything at all. About the only thing I did during the pandemic to prep for anything was buy a decent webcam.
Well, I've been eyeing these, like Costco sells these massive packages of prepper meals. And they have, they're massive. And I'm sort of like eyeing them and thinking maybe
What
it's
is in them?
time.
Is it steak?
I'm sure it's cardboard. I'm sure it's just totally foul. But I've been reading the news out of Texas because I have a couple of pals who live there. And during the recent storm, I was worried about them and couldn't do anything. And so like online anxiety shopping seemed like a solution.
Well, we're going to have one of those pals on the show here right next. But first of all, we're going to talk about what the show is. And this is look, there's been a lot of reporting on Texas and what happened down there during the freeze and the power outages. And we're going to talk about all of that. But I also kind of want to talk about, I think we want to talk about Texas generally, like basically, what the fuck, Texas? What is going on down there? What is going on in your literature? What is going on with your energy? What is going on with your politics? Texas is just, what the fuck?
So one of us is a family-friendly host and one of us is Whitney. Just kidding, sort of. I
have to say, Missourians don't like Texans. We just don't. I have an anti-Texas prejudice. I'm gonna admit
Anyway, later in the show, we'll be talking to Natalia Sylvester about growing up in and writing about Texas. But first, we are joined by returning guest and my pal, all-star Lacy M. Johnson.
Lacy is a Houston-based professor and curator and activist and is author of 3 books, including Trespasses, a memoir, The Other Side, and most recently, The Reckonings, which was named a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist in criticism and one of the best books in 2018 by Boston Globe, Electric Literature, Autostraddle, Book Riot, and Refinery 29. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Los Angeles Times, Paris Review, The Virginia Quarterly Review, Tin House, Guernica, Fourth Genre, Creative Nonfiction, and elsewhere. She teaches creative nonfiction at Rice University and is the founding director of the Houston Flood Museum. Lacy, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. It's really great to talk to you both.
So great to see you. We're so glad to see you, and also so glad that you're okay. I know that some of the story of how your family fared in the recent freeze in Texas, because you were occasionally texting during that period. But can you walk our listeners through the timeline of your experience and tell us what the situation's like now?
Sure. So the timeline was, in the week leading up to the storm, I think people were increasingly aware that it was going to freeze. Anytime that it drops below freezing in Houston, it is on the news. It's a big deal just because Houston doesn't really have the infrastructure to deal with freezing temperatures. As I was saying to you, Sugi, in our text messages, a lot of the homes in Houston are built on pier and beam. And so the plumbing runs underneath, is uninsulated. And if it drops below freezing, your pipes can break. If there's freezing rain, as they were predicting for this storm, or ice, we don't have snow plows and salt trucks and all the things that growing up in the Midwest in Missouri, that sort of get you through a storm like that. So there was a lot of messaging in advance of the storm to just be prepared to hunker down, as we do when there's a storm coming, a hurricane or something else like that. So we, purchased a lot of food and were prepared to stay in our house for 5 days, 6 days, and not leave while the roads were, impassable. But then, the storm was scheduled to arrive Sunday into Monday. So we woke up, we went to bed Sunday night, expecting the storm to arrive. Monday morning we woke up, there was snow on the ground. My kids were super excited because they have seen snow maybe a handful of times in their life. And put on winter coats and went outside and scraped together some gloves and made these tiny little snow people, which was charming and great. But there was no power, like we didn't have any power. And because there was no power, we also didn't really have any cell reception, and didn't really have any way to get information about what was going on. And so slowly, I guess we didn't really have any information that whole day. And the first day, Monday, we were without power for 24 hours. Our house got down to about 35 degrees inside the house overnight. That was the night that our pipes froze the first time. We got a little bit of power on Tuesday for about 10 hours. And then we were without power for another 36 hours after that.
35 degrees in the house is not good.
No, it's not.
What were you doing? When I was a kid, I remember we would light candles and, do that sort of thing. Was that what it was like?
Yeah. I mean, during the day, it was light enough so we didn't have to light candles, but we have a gas powered fireplace. We had that on. We were cooking our food with a propane camping stove in the garage. We had these little power banks to keep our cell phones charged and things like that. And we're making frequent trips to sit in the car to get warm, to turn the car on and get warm and try to listen to the radio and learn what was going on. But yeah, then the second time we were without power 36 hours and all the food spoiled in the fridge. The house got to about 40 degrees that time.
You should have left the fridge open then. You could have, or maybe put stuff outside.
I know. Yeah, that would have been better. We didn't think, we put a lot of stuff outside to keep it cold, but the stuff that we hadn't put outside to freeze, it was done for. Then there was a boil order. So water wasn't safe to drink for people who had running water in their houses. We didn't have water running because the pipes were frozen. But people who don't have electricity can't boil their water. And water was sold out of stores. There wasn't any food. There wasn't any way to cook. It really felt like being on the precipice of something much, much worse. Like, I think really sort of understood how the kind of infrastructure that makes life comfortable every single day creates a veil in some ways about how close we are to catastrophe at all times, right? It's just you flip a switch and people can't drink, they can't eat, they can't flush their toilets, right? You can't, much less take a shower or wash your hands during a pandemic, right? So now power is mostly restored, but even this past week was the first time I was able to find milk. I know a lot of students at Rice and at other universities still don't have their Wi-Fi restored, their power still a little shady. So things are still not quite back to normal.
I was shocked when you said you were excited about the milk and you texted and you were like, milk. And I was like, oh my God, it's been days.
Right.
I was surprised.
Yeah, it was 2 weeks, I think, between the time that the storm hit and then we were able to find, that things were back in the stores at regular sort of like normal stock. There was, even when the electricity came back on, everything in the stores had spoiled also. So getting all of that back. And then once it does get in the store, then there's a run on supplies. And so it took quite a lot of time for things to be in stock and be normal. But, the sort of joke running around Houston was, 2020 was the year without toilet paper and 2021 is the year without toilets. So
did you consider leaving the state?
Where would we go? I mean, Texas is as big as France. Like it would have taken, if we go north, it's like 6 hours to get to Oklahoma. And, gas was scarce here. I imagine it was scarce all along the way. Going east, Louisiana had it just as bad. Like there was not a lot of places that we could go, and roads weren't safe. I mean, the roads were frozen. So we were just sort of trapped here.
I remember that one of the things that happened during this, right at the beginning, you were saying that, oh, we got warnings that it's going to be like a Category 5 hurricane. And to what I suspect will be my enduring shame, I was like, really? I just kind of didn't believe in it. I mean, I grew up in Maryland where, someone sneezes and there's a little snow, like everything grinds to a halt immediately. And now I live in Minnesota where, you could have several feet of snow and people would go on stoically.
Yeah.
And how did you, like, when you thought about, did you believe those?
I did believe it because, I mean, my husband and I joke about that too, because I told him the thing about the Category 5 and he also kind of laughed. He's like, that's ridiculous, but as I was saying, like Houston doesn't have the infrastructure to survive a storm like that. And most, the home, as we saw, in our home, pipes froze, and we don't have that sort of pier and beam construction, so the pipes aren't on the bottom, the pipes are in the attics, but our pipes froze. And I've actually heard now that there were more insurance claims on this storm than there were during Harvey. And Harvey, I think something like 200. I'm still haven't gotten the official accounting, but it's 200,000 homes, 300,000 homes had flooding during Harvey. So more homes than that sort of submitted insurance claims during this storm. But I did not expect there to be a power outage, right? That was not part of the messaging. And I grew up in the Midwest too. Like I grew up in Missouri. I lived in Kansas City during the freeze in 2001. Was it 2002? Do you remember, Whitney? Were you there?
I remember there've been a lot of those ice storms that then bring down branches that then send the power out. I've lived here too long to remember what year that one was, but there have been many.
It was 2000. I think it was 2002. And I lived in Lee Summit at the time, and the home that I lived in, we didn't have power for a week, but it was because of downed power branches, or not downed power lines, branches hitting power lines and downing them. But it was just a really different kind of situation from what happened here.
Well, we did. I mean, speaking of the power grid, and that's what we want to talk about a little bit here. We had power blackouts in Kansas City, which was very surprising to me. That has never happened, like deliberate blackouts, like where the company says, "Hey, we're shutting down." I mean, I feel like, look, you're a regulated monopoly. Your one damn job is to make sure that we have power, and you're not doing it. Now, I'm sure that people in Texas are feeling a little bit frustrated about ERCOT, the nonprofit that runs Texas's power grid. We're not going to break any news here. People have talked a lot about this, but I want to just sort of set up what is unique about Texas's power grid and talk a little bit about the role deregulation plays in this disaster.
Sure. So as I understand it, there are 3 power grids in the United States, right? There's the Eastern Connection, there's the Western Connection, and then there's Texas. And Texas has a separate power grid from the rest of the US, mainly to avoid federal oversight and regulation. Because the Texas power grid does not cross state lines, it avoids being subjected to federal rules. But what I think is, and honestly, I had not thought about the Texas power grid before all of this happened. But what I've learned is that ERCOT and the power grid in general is resistant even to state regulation. So ERCOT is mainly in charge of managing the grid, and it is regulated or overseen by the Public Utilities Commission of Texas. And the people on the Public Utilities Commission are appointed by the governor. And they have to follow the rules that are written by the legislature. But ERCOT then manages the grid, including making sure that the grid is reliable, that there's enough power for the demand, and also protect it from failure. You know, one of the pieces of news that's come out is that we were 9 minutes and 15 seconds or something away from catastrophic failure of the grid that would have resulted in months of blackouts for essentially the entire state of Texas. But ERCOT, because it is just Texas, it's outside of the jurisdiction of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It does so ERCOT does have some ties to other grids in other states, and there are historic examples of where we have exported power to Oklahoma, for example, or imported it from Mexico. But in general, I think the folks in charge here want to keep it independent so that they don't have to be subjected to federal oversight.
And so part of the issue is, my understanding is like that they couldn't then say, hey, East Coast, we like some power, we're having a problem, right? They're on their own. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So, I mean, I think there are several inputs where they potentially could have requested power be imported. And I haven't heard yet why they did not do that or why that didn't happen. And there's a sort of like swirl of information still around this, and I haven't quite sorted out what exactly happened or why there wasn't sufficient production. You know, the governor went on Fox News to say it was because of windmills, frozen windmills, but that's not true. There was windmills were producing about what everybody expected to. Solar panels were producing what they expected to, but it was the sort of thermal power generators, nuclear. I think even that produced mostly what they expected it to, but the gas and coal-fired power plants froze or weren't winterized. So there's that sort of information. But then I've also seen information about how it may have been a market thing, that there wasn't clearance to buy gas at the price that it was being sold for. And so they didn't want to lose money by generating energy and not being able to recoup it. And so there may have been something related to the market that generated this problem as well.
So a friend of mine who lives in El Paso said to me that El Paso is on a separate power grid and she was fine. And I was like, what? There's like, why is that?
Yeah, so there are a couple of places where they you know, like up in the Panhandle, they're on a different power grid. Beaumont and the very eastern part is on a different power grid. They're connected to the eastern power grid, and El Paso is connected to the western power grid. But even like the Panhandle is closer to Kansas City than it is to us. So they're on the power grid as well. Yeah.
Interesting.
Speaking of the purchasing of power within, you know, and getting to a point where utility is like paying for power and then having to charge a ridiculous amount, which some people got really high electricity bills or worrying that they won't be able to recoup their costs. That is what happened to a certain extent in California in 2000. That later came out that Enron, as you pointed out to me before this interview, a Houston-based company, so well within the WTF Texas theme of this, you know, started manipulating energy trading within the market in California that led to blackouts there. It's a huge scandal, I think, that everyone has forgotten about, but I just wanted to make that connection. Like, we know deregulation, this is what happens when you deregulate your energy market, I think. You know, and I just want to mention, since we mentioned other books, you know, The Smartest Guys in the Room is a book that explains this. That's by Bethany McLean and Peter Elkin, if people want to look that up.
It's great. And there's also a really great documentary by the same name, right? The Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room. And I think that was sort of my introduction to the energy, to that round of energy crisis, right? The sort of 90s and early aughts. But yeah, I mean, Enron lobbied really hard for deregulation on a national scale. And partly that, I guess their rationale for doing so for passing the Energy Policy Act of 1992, which resulted in things like low flush toilets and carbon emissions and some things that were good. But they also suggested that deregulation would increase competition, and increased competition would result in more energy production and lower energy prices. This is always the alibi, right?
Whenever people say we're going to have increased competition, it is time to run away screaming.
Of course. But what actually happened was that more competition created more demand for electricity, and that allowed producers to charge more for electricity. And so producers used events where energy was scarce, right, where energy demand spiked, to inflate the price of energy. And that was the thing that we saw in Texas a couple of weeks ago during the freeze, where low energy production and high demand allowed producers to gouge prices. And that's why we're seeing folks getting energy bills for $10,000 or $20,000 or above. And originally ERCOT said that they were going to sort of find a way to correct those bills and absorb the cost. But there was just a news report from yesterday saying that they're not going to do that. They're planning to let these bills stand because they wouldn't want to leave businesses holding the bag for those high charges. Never mind that it's, of course, going to bankrupt many consumers.
And I remember that there was I remember during the crisis reading about a company that was advising its customers to leave. I would think it was Gritty that was telling people, like, you should run away from us.
Right.
This whole thing brought back a name that I'd like to try out on y'all. Jeff Skilling. Yeah. Anybody remember that guy? He was the head of Enron. Here's a quote from him at the time. He's talking about California utilities. As the utilities credit exposure gets too high, we will limit the amount of power we deliver into California, Skilling said at the time. Eventually, the state is going to have to provide these companies with the credit support from somewhere to support their purchases. Basically, like saying, like, we're going to squeeze the power down just to raise the prices, and we're going to make the state pay for it. It's kind of insane.
Right. And that's, I mean, the news I'm still parsing through, again, from this particular storm, it seems to, like, there's a memo circulating around from the Public Utilities Commission that says that it was sort of giving the green light for producers to charge the maximum amount for energy during the freeze. And that thinking that that would be a motivator for creating more production, right? That if they can charge the maximum amount, they will produce more, hoping to get more money, right? And there's, I can't remember his name. He's some billionaire in Dallas who's in charge of one of these natural gas energy companies. But he, told his board of directors, like, this is a jackpot for us. Like, this whole freeze, like, we are raking in the dough because we're able to gouge prices. So, I mean, I'm sure this will go down in history as another kind of scandal like that.
I teach an article by Matt Taibbi that's about Goldman Sachs' role in deregulation, the one that's about the vampire squids, Goldman Sachs, the vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity. So I just, I feel like there are lots of good articles there about deregulation is a difficult topic to talk about, but I just feel like it has to be driven home. Like, please pay attention to this, that these things have results. All right. I want to know how this is playing out in politicians' minds. The governor of Texas is facing re-election. Texas is generally considered a red state, although, maybe it's changing. You'd think the party in power would want to prevent disasters like this, but conservative failures to attend to natural disaster are starting to feel repetitive. Do you think it's possible that Republicans actually privately think that allowing these disasters to ravage the state is somehow in their political interest? I'm thinking of Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism thesis here, that the sort of disasters make it easier to pass unpopular ideas that you, a business-friendly, tax-cutting Republican, might like. Or these simply failures are just bad governance and the GOP is going to be voted out?
I don't think the GOP will be voted out, but not because what they're doing is good. Texas is a red state, but it's also a voter suppression state, and it's gerrymandered within an inch of its life. But to your point about the disaster capitalism thesis, I think it's definitely borne out here by the evidence every disaster that happens here in Texas, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. We saw that with Harvey, and I really have no doubt that we're going to see it again with the freeze. And of course, we see it in the pandemic as well, not just in Texas, right? I saw there was a report in January from the Institute for Policy Studies, and that showed that American billionaires increased their wealth by over 1 trillion during the pandemic, and that during the same time, we've seen the sharpest rise in poverty rates in the last 50 years. And I think regarding the freeze, we saw that, kind of disparate impact as well, where people who are economically disenfranchised, have no way to boil water, have no way to eat food, like they are really sort of on the verge of social collapse. And somebody like Ted Cruz is hopping on a plane to go to Cancun, right? That it's just really so, to your question about policies, I don't know that they're like, Dr. Evil, like sitting in their lair, petting their bald cat. Sorry, that's my dog, who, hates Dr. Evil, plotting out the destruction of people. But I really think they don't have the best interest of Texas and Texans in mind, that they are thinking about how to make their donors wealthy and protect their interests, but not about people who are freezing to death in their apartments or in their mobile homes, right? And to me, that's more a sort of example of like Mbembe's thesis in necropolitics, right? That the ultimate in power is the power to kill, right? And I think that they are really invested in that kind of power.
Yeah, I think one of the most striking images for me in reading about this was that there was a photograph of Austin, and it was just sort of like split right down the middle, and you could see half of Austin lit up and half of it not. And this isn't, as you've said, this isn't the first time Texas has struggled in the aftermath of natural disaster. And you've written about Harvey, and in Harvey as well, like marginalized populations, and specifically Black and Hispanic Houstonians were disproportionately affected. How can we talk about this differently to highlight that that's an ongoing issue? Because I feel like I don't know, despite everything, it feels like that keeps getting buried.
Right. I mean, in the aftermath of the storm, it was, when power came back on and I was able to go back on social media, right? I was so bewildered by the kind of punching down that was happening about Texans, that, that this is what we asked for, and, let us freeze because we are, governed by these terrible Republicans. And just sort of the idea that that it's that people here, it's our fault that we asked for this. That, in many ways, that's a different version of the same thesis that the GOP offers, which is that everything is an individual responsibility, right? That it's an individual's responsibility to make sure they're governed by the right people, despite the fact, as I said, that there's voter suppression and terrible gerrymandering here, right? It's harder to vote in Texas than it is in any other state. But the GOP is particularly fond, I think, of suggesting that we're all personally responsible for everything that happens to us, or doesn't, and that individual responsibility is how we sort of think through climate change or disasters, that we all need to be individually prepared. But I don't think that individual responsibility is going to result in the kind of transition that we need, right? I mean, it's been shown time and time again that 20 corporations are generating a third of all carbon emissions in the world. And yet I'm asked to focus right on my individual carbon footprint or my individual choices. But of course, the idea of a carbon footprint is a marketing tactic used by fossil fuel companies to push responsibility for transition onto consumers. And of course, the fossil fuel industry is also located here in Texas, right?
That's right in the WTF Texas category. I also would like to bring up.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's supposedly the energy capital of the world. And so, beyond ironic that we spent 3 days in the dark.
Just the same deal, like if you follow markets, energy companies have been trading extremely well recently because related to, in some ways, oil prices going up, but also I think, hey, we found a way to make people really need a lot of energy here. I mean, they benefit from this. It's not bad.
Right. From the power outage, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and that's definitely the way they're spinning it in the news, right? As I said, with Abbott on talking about frozen windmills are the reason that we were all without power. And so they're definitely using it as a case to make for sticking with natural gas at the very least. And the reason that we still need fossil fuels is because of collapses like this. But they're they're just refuse to draw the connections to think about how those those emissions result in increasingly rare weather events happening more and more often, right?
I mean, once you start lying, it gets farther and farther away from being able to govern. So, I mean, if you say there's no climate change, then you can easily say like, well, this was caused by windmills when it wasn't. I mean, it's just like we have a party that feels like it has untethered from reality and can say whatever it wants, and as long as it can get itself reelected, however, that's going to stay that way. I don't see it getting better. All right. Speaking of telling the truth, however, we got a sneak peek at your forthcoming edited anthology, More City Than Water, a Houston Flood Atlas. And your introduction touches on some of the issues we've been discussing. Would you read from that to us?
Sure. So I'll just say very quickly about the Flood Atlas. This is a collection of essays and artfully rendered maps about flooding in Houston, sort of coming out of Hurricane Harvey, but obviously, Hurricane Harvey wasn't the first time Houston flooded, and it's certainly not the last. So yeah, this is just a piece from the introduction. All water has a perfect memory, Toni Morrison writes, but people tend to forget. Or perhaps we remember quite well, but the memory of water is longer than our own. 2 years after Hurricane Harvey, Houston flooded again, this time from Tropical Storm Imelda, which dropped 43 inches of rain in 2 days. This flood made the 5th 500-year flood Houston had suffered in 5 years. For the 5th year in a row, we pulled one another from submerged vehicles and flooded homes. This time, a man drowned in his van, another in a pickup, one in a car, another trying to rescue his horse. One man drowned in a ditch. For a short time, the entire town of Whitney, Texas was underwater. Port Arthur was destroyed again. Barges containing toxic chemicals crashed into one another along the Houston Ship Channel again, but the second largest petrochemical complex in the world continued to supply the only nation to have withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accord with enough petroleum and natural gas to cause ice in the Arctic to melt, to cause sea levels to rise, and to cause natural disasters become more catastrophic here and around the world every single year. Our growing numbness to these events makes us more susceptible to disaster in the future, not less. Houston is designed to flood, I have heard people say again and again, as they replace more and more of the coastal prairie with streets and interstates and apartment buildings and enormous multi-million-dollar estates. But I do not hear anyone saying what this means when we see that catastrophic flooding does not touch people's lives equally. In the greater Greenspoint area, which is a neighborhood in Houston, a low-income community situated along Greens Bayou, some homes have flooded more than 10 times since Hurricane Allison in 2001. In Independence Heights, the first Black municipality in Texas, homes never flooded until TxDOT built the 610 interchange. On the east side, near the Ship Channel, residents not only deal with chronic catastrophic flooding from rain and storm surges, but also with the flooding of toxins, and not only when it rains. In contrast, the wealthiest neighborhoods, especially those located in the city center, River Oaks, Montrose, and West University. They almost never flood at all. This is a story that needs telling, even if the official one resists change. In this city, buildings go up, buildings come down. 100,000 people move here every year, cramming into tiny apartments or 3-bedroom homes in suburbs or tents along the bayou or vast sprawling estates. Refineries churn thousands of tons of toxic chemicals into the air every year, and gardens bloom here every day. An ideal map of the city should include, marked in different inks, this history and all its implications, articulated and silent, evident and hidden.
Thank you so much. That's such a striking passage, and I'm so eager to see the Flood Atlas. The show has really frequently discussed the importance of writing about climate change clearly and simply and persuasively, and we've had a few writers on talking about that. I feel like here you're talking about, and also in that passage, we can hear another important communication need, which is writing about infrastructure clearly and persuasively, and making clear that it's urgent, and it's not at all a conventionally sexy topic, right? It's not narratively convenient for, say, some of the maybe Eurocentric structures actually that we're used to. So are there particular successes and failures of writing or language that you've encountered in reading and writing about this, and writing about the frieze specifically?
I mean, writing about the frieze specifically, I think there are a couple pieces that have come out that really I found quite moving, but I think there hasn't been a ton of public thinking by people here in Houston yet, because we are all quite traumatized, I think. I mean, there was one piece that came out written by a friend of mine, Rajman Kad, who's now the op-ed editor at the Houston Chronicle. And he was talking about about the trauma tax of living in Houston. And it's a great piece about how Houston is such a great place to live. It's cheap, it's affordable, it's, you know, one of the most diverse cities in the country. There's great food, great music. There's so many wonderful things about it, but we have to deal with climate disasters happening over and over again. And the kind of accumulating trauma of those disasters takes a toll. You know, and he sort of profiles in that piece different people who are, you know, who had not yet recovered from Harvey, who are impacted by the pandemic, who are then, you know, impacted again by the freeze. And just the way that like living here is hard. But I, for one, continue to do it because it's my home, it's a place I love, and it's a city I think that's worth fighting for.
Thank you, Lacy, so much for coming on to talk to us about Texas and your work. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you too. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Lacy. And listeners, don't forget to pick up Lacy's most recent collection, The Reckonings, and to be on the lookout for the Flood Atlas, which I think is going to be amazing.